Hello and welcome to the Russia Question. I'm Michael Ossorgin, Director of the Russian Program at Fordham University at Lincoln Center. This webinar is one of the many initiatives of Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center, which facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We encourage you to follow us on YouTube and share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from them. Today, Terry Tilley joins us to discuss The Karamazov Case, Dostoevsky's Argument for His Vision, published in 2023. And that was done by T&T Clark, Explorations at the Crossroads of Theology and Aesthetics. This book, Tilley's book, which it uncovers the polyphonic novel's hidden layers, revealing religious, philosophical, and social insights. Tilley's book transcends traditional approaches, offering a deeper understanding of unity, hope, and sacramental themes. Regarding Terry Tilley's history, he was a professor and department chair, Department of Theology, Fordham University. Prior to that, he was a professor and department chair in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Dayton. And before that, he taught at Florida State University. He's the author or editor of 13 previous books, including Story Theology, and many of the rest published by Orbis Books, The Evils of Theodicies, Postmodern Theologies, and the Challenge of Religious Diversity, Inventing the Catholic Tradition, and History, Theology, and Faith, Dissolving the Modern Problematic. Story Theology was named Book of the Year 1986 by the College Theology Society. Inventing Catholic Tradition took first place in theology from the Catholic Press Association. He is a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the College Theology Society. I heartily welcome you to our webinar, Terry, and would like to give you the opportunity to open with a few words about your fantastic book.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that very much. Fyodor Dostoevsky's final masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, responds to profound religious, moral, and philosophical questions current in his time and in ours. The novel shows multiple ways of living in the world he created and in ours. It offers a narrative response to those who reject religious faith as irrational in his time and in ours. It challenges readers to understand their own lives, to recognize the visions by which they live, and to see what it means to live their lives in accordance with those visions, in his time and in ours. The oceans of commentary on the novel that I first encountered 30 years ago as I began to use the novel in seminars on God and evil displayed very roughly two currents. A critical view takes Ivan Fyodorovich Karamazov's vivid and profound challenges to belief in God as unanswered and unanswerable. Ivan's Rebellion, Book 4, Chapter 5, and The Grand Inquisitor pull no punches. Many commentators find the rebuttal Dostoevsky penned in the novel to be a total failure. The other current admires the vision of the novel expressed through the unfailing involvement of Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov, the guidance of Father Zosima, the elder to whom Alyosha conformed while living in the monastery, as showing the way to care with and for our neighbors who share with us this ravaged icon of God's world. These visionary reactions see a harsh and fearful act of love, the way to care for people when no cure for the ills of humanity is possible. In The Karamazov Case, Dostoevsky's argument for his vision, I argue that both currents are too shallow. The negative critics fail to recognize the whole argument Dostoevsky makes in and by the novel. The positive responders recognize facts of Ivan's testimony, but to share the faith that Dostoevsky's vision of a Christian response nonetheless stands as portraying a life worth living. Dostoevsky is much more subtle and powerful than either response recognizes. First, most of the commentators assume the adequacy of the essentialized binary faith versus reason approach. Joseph Frank epitomizes this, writing that, quote, the main theme of the novel is the conflict between reason and faith, close quotes. This unexamined modernist bias fails to note that Dostoevsky himself portrays not two forms of faith, reason versus two forms of life, reason versus faith, Ivan versus Alyosha and Zosima, but at least 6 mentalités. Materialism, represented by Ivan, realism, Alyosha and others. Irrational sensualism, especially Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. Superstition, a Father Farapon. Religious naivete, peasant believers. And selfish manipulation, Rakitin. An incipient 7th type is not fully developed. That is the blinkered bureaucrat or apparatchik, some of the judges, lawyers, and doctors. Portraying what it means to live in these forms of life is crucial to understanding Dostoevsky's argument. The faith versus reason optic is deceptive, obscuring Dostoevsky's passion, his vision, and his whole argument. Second, Dostoevsky has 2 interrelated arguments to make his case. One is the argument in the novel, the graceful response of realists to evils in the world and the inadequacy of materialism. Never once, except in a parody of the Good Samaritan parable, does Ivan act to help others. He never asks why the horrors he narrates occur, but only reports the facts about the horrors. In contrast, Dmitri, in a dream sequence, asks why these evils occur, taking the first step to addressing such evils concretely. Moreover, Ivan's rebellion uses I, or the equivalent, 63 times in 81 lines, according to Robert Louis Jackson, while Alyosha's speech at the stone uses we and its variants 57 times in a similar length speech. Ivan's materialism is that of an isolated cognitive monad. And if one analyzes his utterance in Book 4, Chapter 3, never anthologized, his views are self-defeating. Close reading shows that Ivan's argument flails at best, and that active realism is not defeated by Ivan, but is a viable form of life. The other argument is an argument by the novel. It is against the materialistic pseudo-Kantianism of some Russian radicals of Dostoevsky's time and individualistic materialism of any time. Ivan's inability to move beyond the facts he discovers, guided only by Kant's first great question, what can I know, leads him both to contemplate committing suicide after the apogee of his life and paralyzed in madness by the end of the novel. Ivan's mentalité is self-destructive. In contrast, Alyosha shows that pure reason uncovering the facts requires that we engage in practical reasoning, asking what we can and should do. Dostoevsky thus revises Kant's second great question. The novel asks and answers, what can we do? Dostoevsky's answer is not like Kant's, that we need to adhere to a categorical imperative necessary to earn happiness. Rather, he narrates a life devoted to reconciliation, caring with and for others. That sort of life can bring happiness as a blessed gift, not a merited reward. And through the harsh and fearful love strewn throughout the novel, but especially in the gift of love Grushenka and Dmitri give each other, Dostoevsky shows what may we hope. If we love actively, we together may hope that a love like theirs is an icon, transparent to the infinite love at the heart of reality. Now, Dostoevsky's whole argument is cognitive, active, and aesthetic. He does not demonstrate his claims, but elucidates in and by his narrative what it means to live in these forms of life. The argument of the Brothers Karamazov is polyphonic. All of these forms of life are narrated as competing voices in the novel. As Mikhail Bakhtin put it, quote, the unity of the polyphonic novel, a unity standing above the word, above the voice, above the accent, has yet to be discovered. Why? Because the novel is dialogic. It is incomplete until the readers take it up and allow themselves to be challenged to respond to it. Whatever unity is given is found in and through the reader's responses to the novel. The polyphony of the novel gives the readers room to react. The Brothers Karamazov is a profound challenge. Can we realize that we are making the future, living in and living out whatever our mentalités are as we think, judge, act, and hope? Realism, sensualism, irrationalism, superstition, manipulation, all of these are prominent forms of life in his day and in ours. The novel challenges us to respond. What is my form of life? Is it worth living? What can we know? What ought we do? What may we hope? Dostoevsky challenges his readers to answer and evaluate those questions in his day and in ours, or so I claim. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Terry. The way that this structure is going to work here for our conversation, just for our audience to begin their involvement. We encourage you to enter your questions into the Q&A as Terry and I discuss a few questions that I have for him, after which I'll read your questions out to Terry and we'll discuss them that way. So enter those into the Q&A at any point, please. As for my starter questions, I am hoping that you could tell our listeners what realism means within the novel. Wouldn't each of the characters view their mentalite as the real one? And how do they discover that they are religiously naive or manipulators? Can they come to see the end of their own vision?
I am not sure that actually happens in the novel. I think the novel in that sense is didactic. It wants us to see these forms of life as well as we can. Now, the realist, that is Dostoevsky's name for Ivan, or for Alyosha and Zosima. And so I just adapted that name. But the realist realizes, and that's intentional, the realist realizes the world and realizes what the world requires of him or her or them. And so it's not something that abstracts from the world. That's what the materialist does. The materialist does not have room for action. So I portray Ivan as the materialist who is, in a sense, stuck in Kant's first critique. What can I know? Ivan never is able to cope with what ought we or what ought I do. A realist simply can't look at the world. The realist realizes the world, and in responding to it, has to realize that that response is part of realizing the world. I know that that's an awfully complex or silly use of realism or realization, but I think that's I think the heart of the novel.
Right, and speaking of the heart of the novel, the narrator author also refers to Alyosha as bearing the heart of the whole. And I'm wondering if it's possible for Alyosha to sort of bear traits of each of these mentalities within himself. I think I think it's exactly right to say that for Ivan, it's almost as if he thinks he can witness the world without being in it, right? That is, he doesn't realize that by assuming his position on the outside of the main action, that is a type of regenerating of the icon, the desecrated icon that has been entrusted to him, right? And it has devastating effects. That is, by believing that he could stand on the outside of it and not participate on it, he ends up having an extraordinary effect in it, right? So I understand that in that sense, Ivan is very much not a realist. He's not only sort of rejecting the world that's been given to him, but he believes that he can actually not participate in realizing it, right?
That's exactly correct. Well said. Thank you, Michael. You understand my book better than I do.
Right. Well, I'm happy to hear that you feel that way. I certainly, as I mentioned before, had a hard time finding qualms with it, and that's unusual, as I also mentioned before, because I spend so much time thinking about it. Well, do you think that Alyosha could have uh, all of these mentalities within himself at some level? Like, for instance, religious naivete. When he's told the story of the elders, the institution of elders, right? There was that legend that um, somebody there was somebody who had taken vows to a certain elder and then disappeared, right? And tried to be buried somewhere else. But his coffin was ejected out of the church at his funeral until they realized, oh, it's because he had taken an obedience to an elder, right? And Alyosha, the narrator says, believed it without thinking, right? I mean, so, and of course, there are other instances of that, but do you think that Alyosha can contain all of these other mentalities?
I think the answer is some of them. Obviously, religious naivete is one of them. I don't think Alyosha is not tempted towards sensualism, but the kind of selfish manipulation that Rakitin displays is, it feels terribly alien to me. In light of your question, what I think makes the novel work is I suspect from my reading of the various biographies of Dostoevsky that maybe all of these mentalités were in his head and in his heart, somewhere in his life, whether it was his gambling and sensuality, whether he was manipulative at times, I don't know. I mean, the biographies don't think about this in terms of the mentalités in the Brothers Karamazov, because, to be blunt, I don't think people take those mentalités seriously enough. But rather than Alyosha having all of them, I don't think so. Many of them, yes, certainly, possibly. But I suspect that we're looking into Dostoevsky's heart here, that there is more autobiography in this novel than people want to admit. Now, I could be simply wrong about that and speak subject to correction, but that's the kind of thing that struck me. Is how could he write these things unless there were some ways, unless this was him or a great close observation?
Right. You mentioned how Ivan can't sort of see outside of the novel as a whole in the same way, right? I think that applies to other characters. And Alyosha, yeah, one of the reasons I think why he's inadvertently cruel to Rakitin is because he doesn't sort of understand Rakitin's manipulation, right? Or when for instance Rakitin takes him to Grushenka's, and Alyosha sort of mentions inadvertently that Rakitin is related to Grushenka, and Rakitin gets offended. He doesn't understand how that plays into Rakitin's manipulation, where he's always trying to sort of put his best foot forward and look better, much better than he actually is. Whatever the context, he's a chameleon in that way. But I agree that Alyosha has none of that manipulator, or very little of it, let's say, in him. So if we could pause for just one quick second on Ivan, I think what you write about him being a materialist is true, even though you would think, well, he's such an abstract thinker that you wouldn't think that in the first place. And yet you talk about how he sort of limits himself to the three dimensions of Euclidean geometry, which is what he claims where he claims he's stuck, right? And it seems like Ivan also has a problem with time, with the fourth dimension, that is, with things that are in flux, or with process, or with change. Towards the end of the book, and forgive me for developing this thought, you cite Rowan Williams, who says that commitment to the world and to restoring its icon is also it's a story, it's a process, it's a commitment to something that must be endured over time, right? And Ivan sort of lacks that capacity. He's all about finitude, or three-dimensional shapes that start here and end here and are concealed here. But anything beyond that is a real problem for him. Is that what you mean by Ivan's being a materialist, that he limits himself to things that have finite shape?
Yes, I mean, I think the key for that, for me, was that it seems to me that he is following the dictates of Kant's first critique, the critique of pure reason, and that critique provides a certain kind of materialism. Again, that's Dostoevsky's words, that really makes it impossible to go outside of that. F.C.S. Schiller, late in the 19th century, noted that the notion of non-Euclidean geometries gives great difficulty to Kantian modes of thought, and I think that's anticipated by Dostoevsky when he has Ivan denying that even if he saw it before his own eyes, he could not accept that parallel lines met at infinity. So I think that's what was a way for me to understand it. And remember, for the reason, one of the reasons Kant wrote the second critique, the critique of practical reason, and had to postulate God and immortality, was to bring in practical, including moral reason. So within the critique of pure reason, there's no such thing as freedom. There's no such thing as spirituality. There's no such thing as a spirit unless there's some kind of spirit coming that's generated by matter. So it's a very limited understanding, and it is, as you've pointed out, externalist, as though I am not a participant in the world. I am an observer, but not a participant. And that's inadequate. And that's inadequate, as I think Dostoevsky's claim, especially with Alyosha and Zosin.
Right. So that Ivan can't see God because he doesn't exist for Ivan in the sense of standing out, right, or taking shape in some obviously concrete form. Again, for Ivan, right? Whereas Zosima sort of presents the opposite of the opposite worldview of the ocean, right, where discretion or discreteness of things, isolation, objects actually ultimately break down, and that's the sort of reality and the fluctuation and the process in which we are immersed with or without our permission. Right.
And I would add that I think this is indicated by one of the very few true things Fyodor says: Ivan cannot love. And so if you can't engage in practical reasoning, practical thought, practical stuff, you can't love.
Excellent. So then that opens the door to our next question, which centers around sobornost, which is rooted in a kind of love. It's almost, it occurred to me preparing for this that, where Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am." Zosima might say, and you could correct it, as you see fit, I am not until I love actively, right? Or I love, therefore I am, in the sense of this sort of arduous task of loving the concrete person daily over an extended period of time, right? And this connects to sobornost, which you write about at length here, and I think rightfully so. You cite Khomyakov's definition, which is the communion in love is not only useful, but fully necessary for the apprehension of truth. And the apprehension of truth is dependent upon it and impossible without it. That which is inaccessible for an individual's pondering of truth becomes accessible only by conjoined thought united by love, right? End quote. So you show how Dostoevsky brilliantly renders Kant's great questions from the Critique of Pure Reason to shift from what can I know, what I to do, what may I hope, to, as you say, what can we know, what ought we to do? what may we hope. Can you explain the importance of this relational understanding of truth in Dostoevsky's vision?
I think I would adjust your comment just a little bit.
Yeah.
I love and am loved, therefore I become
Yes.
who I am.
I have, yes, I can give and receive love. Yes, right, according to Zosima, right?
Exactly.
Hell is the suffering of being no longer able to love. Yes, absolutely, well corrected.
And so I thought that using the concept of sobornost was very outrageous in some ways. I was very nervous about it, but the more I read, the more I thought, and the more I pondered the tale of the onion, the more and the more I tried to figure out what Dimitri's trial was about, the more I had to think this through and work on understanding it. I think we are, and one of the things that you said about Ivan, that he doesn't like time, the community of sobornost is in time. I become who I am. I am not free when I'm born. I am totally dependent. I become free as being loved and loving in a community. Freedom is not somehow a right. And of course, it might be a right, but real freedom, my freedom to be who I am and to do what I should, it is not something that is present at birth. We develop it. And so I think understanding truth is the same sort of thing. We learn from others how to think. That's what we have teachers in schools for. We learn from others how to act. We learn how to seek the truth. That's why people do research. I mean, so this is, I think, a tremendous important part of recognizing the community as a necessity in epistemology, which has always been so individualistic. We learn, and I think that that's crucial to understanding sobornost. And it's a community that is interpersonal, not structural or hierarchical. It's
or procedural, yeah,
interpersonal.
Yes.
Yes, truth is learned in community, even because we are not born as fully developed adults who can seek the truth without any training. That's just
right. Right. Yes. So you point to how Zosima argues for having to work in that becoming state, right? In that becoming evolving communal state, right? Communal in the sense of belonging to a community and not in any other sense. And in recognizing difference within that community in the spirit of polyphony, right? Plurality in that sense as well. So not becoming simply like one another, right? Is another qualification. Yeah. But you also point out how so freedom is attained in that community. You also point out how those are the conditions for love to be given freely, right? That is, love comes as a kind of crowning achievement of freedom, or as, I don't know, maybe the purpose, or maybe even the means to freedom. I don't know what you would call it, but either way, it's a gift. It's something that is gifted to you within that community, and that is connected to the truth as the novel presents it. Would you say that's fair?
I think that's right, and I think we always have feelings that we call loving feelings. I mean, that you get babies are supposed to love their mothers. Well, or maybe that's just a projection, but anyway. The notion that there's some feeling there that is kind of the root of this, but that feeling is not sufficient to develop a full interpersonal shared love, which I think, and I'm not sure that I want to say this for sure, but I think ultimately love truly is a virtue, a shared virtue. It's not just a feeling, it's not just an action, it's not just a vision, it's a whole way of life that has to be acquired. And it's not something you necessarily plan to or work to. It's what evolves as you live reasonably well. Now, none of us is perfect. or infallible. So, yeah, we're all going to fail both in our intellect and in our wills and in our hearts. But what we have to notice is that it's a process, and there are goals for that. And the goal is to realize sobornost and to keep it alive.
And you mentioned how that sort of understanding of sobornost is rooted in the Trinity, right? This community of love at the core of creation, holding the possibility for love together, simultaneously modeling it, right? Is that fair to say?
I think that's right. I get very nervous about people who make the Trinity a model for community, which was a move in theology about a decade or two ago I got thought a little heavy-handed. But if you keep it at the metaphor level or the image level, I think that's exactly right.
Got it. The sort of last question I asked before we have a few questions to turn to is a little bit off script. One, I want to know, what is the relationship between humility and truth in Dostoevsky? This is something you cite Paul Cantino's work on incarnational realism as influencing. But I thought that maybe the way we could discuss that is through the book of Job. And there's something about kind of Job being cruelly humbled almost in a certain way that allows him to eventually become an intercessor for those around him with God. That's sort of reducing the book of Job in its scope and oversimplifying it. But by the end, my point is, Job becomes somebody who is an intercessor between between God, or between divinity, between the sort of extra material, I don't know what you want to call it, non-materialist world and materialist world. And it comes through being humbled. In other words, he has to endure the suffering that Ivan describes in his Rebellion chapter. He has to see it. He has to know that it's there. And at the end of the day, like Zosima, he still has to, and like the children at the end of the book, which is something you cover, they come back saying, I bless creation. I still choose creation, having seen all of those things. So can you, in that sort of Jobian context, in the context of the novel, but they're honestly very similar, can you describe what the relationship between humility and truth is in the Brothers Karamazov?
I think I need to say two things. First, Ivan does not have humility. He comes across to me as certain, as arrogant, as almost thinks himself as almost infallible. And so it seems to me that his lack of humility limits his understanding, or there's a correlation between it. I'm not sure if there's what the causal link would be. But if we are truth is something we learn, and we have to learn that we don't know, and that we have to be humbled by our mistakes. We have to be, in that sense, humiliated before we can come to be able to learn the truth. When we can't be humiliated alone. If I'm sitting in my house alone all my life, which is of course impossible, I could never be humiliated. I could never have my finger bit by a boy who's throwing rocks at me. You know, that was humiliating. And Ilyusha being humiliated by Ilyusha is indeed a crucial thing to notice, that we have to know our limits, and we are humbled by realizing, sometimes very painfully, suffering those limits. So I think the issue of, people say, it's really hard to learn the truth. It's for some people, yes, that's true. It's a lot of suffering. but it requires humility. It requires humility in front of the facts, in face of the facts, in face of others, and in face of whatever this whole thing is. I
Right.
also think we have to have humility because we're different and we have different views. We live in a pluralistic society, more than I think Dostoevsky did. And I think that brings us to humility too, that people who are very different from us in outlook have some really good things to say and do. So I think humility is crucial for understanding, learning how to get to the truth.
Right. It's almost one of the ways in which, and there are several ways in which the epigraph plays out in the novel. This seems to be one of them, that sort of humility breaks. If we are an isolated person at the beginning who is the seed dwelling alone, humility sort of breaks you open in such a way that it lets the world in, right? In other words, it reminds you that you belong to the ocean that surrounds you, so to speak, right? Not to mix too many metaphors, but it opens you to the world in such a way that allows for the real possibility of love, right? Doesn't guarantee it, as you're very clear to point out. It just makes the realization of love possible.
Yes.
Wonderful. So let's turn to our questions. John Nilsson asked Terry, doesn't a full account of Ivan require that we factor in his pride? Well put, timely. Over and over, others say Ivan is proud, clearly one of his chief characteristics. Thus, the Seema's emphatic exhortation, don't lie to yourself. So, yeah, how are pride and lying to yourself, I think, connected, maybe?
I think the notion of pride is crucial. I think I think it's obvious that Ivan is proud, and I think and arrogant. So I think that's. I mean, I don't know how to go further with that, but I think
right.
John is entirely correct. So that I can say.
Right. Having an exaggerated sense of self-importance, for instance, is one way of distorting the truth. For instance, just as a sample of what makes John's comment correct. Let's see. George Demokopoulos asks, I continue to learn so much about this novel from the two of you. My question is this: how do we persuade those who are put off by the lack of quality female characters in the novel that either A, this is untrue, or B, that the novel is worth it nonetheless? I know how I would answer it, but I'll let you first. Yeah.
I think Grushenka is a quite an interesting female character, and one of maybe two or three. I think it's like we have to attribute this lack, and it's a serious lack, to the culture in which Dostoevsky was raised and lived, and our culture. Dostoevsky was an unconscious sexist. He was a probably more conscious anti-Semite. He certainly had bad views about the Roman Catholic Church that he probably inherited from his Slavophile friends. So I think you can say, look, you can either see that there's something really worthwhile in the novel and admit it is, like everything on earth, flawed, and in those ways terribly flawed. But I'd say that nonetheless, we have to say that the novel is worthwhile nonetheless, given the problems, and admit the problems that George brings up. It's there, and we can't avoid it, and just have to be right up front about it. It's, as many of the novels of the 19th century, great novels of the 19th century, were, not all by any means. It just doesn't do justice to women.
Yes, I agree. I don't know if I may add to the questions, to sort of directed at both of us. yes, to what you've said, acknowledging it is absolutely essential, that there's no sort of female heroine that shines quite like the brothers do, or even Fyodor, as fully developed, right? And at the same time, they appear in such critical moments. You know, for instance, Alyosha's, you could say, destiny is shaped sort of with his mother's face hovering over him, right? And her her face is connected to the Mother of God icon as well, which is a constant presence not only in Alyosha's life but in Zosima's life. And there are these other moments, like the Cana of Galilee chapter, where what initiates the ushering in of joy at the wedding through the conversion of water to wine, however you want to take that, is the Mother of God's bidding, right? She asks Christ, and you know, that's what initiates, that's what realizes this moment, is her heart opening to this wedding. Moreover, there was in the story of Markel, right, which you mentioned, Terry, as the sort of the prototype for conversion to realism in the novel. How does that one begin? Well, it begins with Markel's mother asking him to confess and come to communion, right? And that initiates this sort of turning to the world to address what's immediately around one. So I don't know that you know, I only want to round it out and in no way to negate the critique, which is fair, I think. But they're present in these powerful ways. Alyosha was raised by women, and I think that's partially why he is who he was in the novel, right? Again, within its limits, according to a dated worldview. So I don't know if that is a solves the problem, but it sort of rounds it out maybe. Turning to Kenneth Scher's question, please explain the difference between what we can know, in quotes, and what can I know? Can knowing be collective? Is this question.
I think knowing is necessarily collective. We know lots of things. I know that the Earth, or that the universe, is 13.7 or so billion years old. I don't know that. I am taught that. Most of our knowledge is based on what we hear from other reliable folk. In Aristotelian ethics, the Nicomachean ethics, you don't become a wise person, a phronimos, unless you are surrounded by other phronimoi who show you the way. So you also don't learn how to think unless you learn from others. Yes, you do it individually, but what can we know is shared knowledge. And I think the paradigm of this is the scientific requirement of repeatability. If the experiment is not repeatable, you know, as the experiment of cold fusion, or the allegation of cold fusion was not repeatable, it's not false. So it's what can we as a community know that counts. And so I think what can we know is one thing. What can I know? Well, I might know things that other people don't, but again, that's based on the practice of learning from other people. So what can we know is most of what I happen to know. And what can I know is dependent on that. Again, this is
Excellent.
that time issue. We learn.
Mm-hmm. Right. From within an interpretive community, let's say, yes, in a given moment, right? Yes.
Yes.
So Paul Valdier asks, writes, because the Brothers Karamazov was Dostoevsky's last and biggest novel, we tend to treat it as his definitive religious statement. Yet, as we know, Dostoevsky was planning a sequel to Brothers Karamazov. At least before he wrote it, he was. Which is to say that he might be said to have viewed the Brothers Karamazov as a work in progress, rather than a definitive statement. What are the implications of this for our view of Dostoevsky's religious vision? And how definite is the presentation of faith that he makes in the Brothers Karamazov?
I think that's a superb question.
It really is.
I've thought about that as well. And I have to say, I don't think we can take it as ultimate. I think we have to take it as this is as far as he got on his road there. The thing that gets to me, I've read bunches of speculation about what that other novel might have looked like, including an assassination of the Tsar and stuff, which seems to me absurd, but okay. But I think there are foreshadowings in the Brothers Karamazov that make it possible to say what's going to change. First, Ivan's rescuing the peasant, that one decent act he performs in the whole novel. There may be hope for Ivan. He's not dead at the end of the novel. He may be mad, but I think it's setting up that this kind of community can even rescue him. And of course, the Grushenko and Dmitri, where are they going in their lives? They would be an obvious candidate for a subsequent novel, or a subsequent novel might be entirely different. So is this his final view? Well, it was, perhaps tragically. It's what we've got. And so I think we have to take it as, yes, that's his final view. But would he have developed other ways? Well, yes, he well might have, but I don't think we can know those. But it's still a darn good question. As you know, Soloviev says that this was just the first in a series of novels that was planned about basically sobornost. So,
well, this is just going off of what you've written in here about polyphony, following Bakhtin, but there is a kind of unfinalizability within the novel itself,
yes.
Right? That is, it does not end in a very real way, in the way that polyphony does not end. It's described, I forget the French music theorist who described it this way, but as infinite motion that at some point just stops because we stop looking at it.
Yeah.
But it's not because the thing itself stops. I know that I've heard Bob Belknap speak about this exact question. And he said, you know, contrary to people like James Rice, scholars like James Rice, who sort of pointed in the direction of, yes, there was a second novel and it was on the way and it was only cut short by Dostoevsky's death. Bob Belknap reaches a different conclusion with that information. And I tend towards his conclusion, which is that when Dostoevsky got to the end of this novel, he realized that it may not need those other ones. That is, that there was something complete in it. And I don't know that that's a fully satisfactory account. What do you think of that, Terry?
I like it. I tend to, that's the way I would tend to think. How can you end a novel by a speech at the Stone and then the boys and Alyosha heading off to a pancake breakfast celebrating a death? The speech at the Stone is a speech that talks about memory and hope, and memory to not forget where we've come from, and hope we do not know where we will go. We just can hope that it will be to a great and good place that is more reconciled than the place we're in today. So let's go have breakfast.
Yes, let's have some pancakes.
Yes.
Blini, that's a translation.
Yes,
A rough translation of Blini. Just so
but that's the way it goes.
You know. Great. Well, I would eventually like to discuss that ending statement, right? The Ura for Karamazov, because you point out a sort of ambiguity that I think is really important there. And before that, let's turn to Gerald McCarthy's question. Do you see similarities and differences between Dostoevsky's strategy and Kierkegaard's in the latter sketches of different styles of life, aesthetic, ethical, religious?
I had not thought of that at all. I think that I just don't know quite how to answer that, because the literary genre are so different. I'd have to it's a extremely good question, but I'd have to really work and think about answering, study to think about answering that.
Yes,
it's beyond an immediate one that I can come up with.
which is the sort of question we want, right? Ones that expand our horizon around this novel. I know that there have been articles written about the absurdity that is an obstacle to faith for Ivan has been connected to Kierkegaard, and that might be a starting place to look at this overlap. So then, yeah. Sorry, did you have something to say?
No, I think that's right, but I also think that the kind of analogous absurdity of a leap of faith, and I'm not a Kierkegaard scholar, so I speak subject to correction, which might be imputed to Alyosha, just doesn't seem to me to fit with the portrayal in the novel. It's, again, I could be wrong about that. It's since it's not something I've thought about, and it takes me a while to think about things like that, things that are difficult, like Jerry's question.
As they should be. They take time. You know, Ivan, you take time with things. Well, then let's turn to the ending, because the sort of ambiguity that you talk about, we may have touched on in our conversation with Paul Cantino a while back, but there's this moment at the end, or very, very near the end. Michael Katz pointed out it's not the final line, but very close to the second to last line, I believe, is this hurrah, right? Hooray for Karamazov.
Yes.
And just before that, they have said hooray for Alyosha Karamazov, right?
Yes.
But there's this lingering question about, all right, well, we've come to the end of this novel in which Ivan cannot justify by any means, and no one can still. I think it's one of the most powerful aspects of his argument, the suffering of innocent children, right? And we come to the end of this novel, and if one were to sort of take a bold stance and say that those children, innocent children, relatively innocent children, are embracing Karamazov, that is saying yes to the whole mess, right, that is generated by the Karamazovs, and the Karamazovs are by extension a sort of are a symbol of that sort of desecrated icon that you describe. If we're saying, if the innocent children are saying hooray to all of it, then that is a kind of opposite stance of Ivan saying, I return the tickets, based on the suffering of innocent children, right? So where do you stand on that? Is that really just hooray for Alyosha Karamazov, or is it an emphatic yes by an innocent child to the whole vision, the whole mess?
I think it's an emphatic yes, with regrets about the mess. Had Alyosha still been alive, perhaps he would have regretted biting Alyosha's finger. But I say that recognizing one of my prejudices, and that is that I was dreadfully moved many decades ago in reading Doug Hammarskjöld's Markings, where in the depths of his pain in the early 50s, a New Year's Day marking came up with, for all that has been, thanks. For all that shall be, yes. So that was so deep in my heart that all I can say is that hooray for Karamazov. For all that has been, thanks. And some of that thanks, I wish you hadn't done it. For all that shall be, yes. We will go forward together as a community. For all that shall be, yes. So I think it's the whole schmear.
Wonderful. I would have had one last qualm with you if you'd said otherwise. No, it's one of those. It's the moment when I realized that Dostoevsky was for real about this vision, that he meant it. There's the sense that you point out. Ivan can't see the whole novel outside of the whole novel in the way that perhaps we can, or the author can. I think that there's something possibly similar about the children saying "Hooray for Karamazov" in such a way that they don't see the whole novel, but Dostoevsky put it in their mouths, right? To say, "I say yes to the entire mess," right? And that's attributing into intention. I'm fully aware, but it also plays out in the novel in that way.
I again, I confess my prejudice and my but I have to agree that it's not just hooray for Alyosha. It's hooray for the whole thing. And so you commented earlier that one of the critics, and I've just lost his name, that didn't think there was going to be another novel, that this was sufficient.
Belknap. Mm-hmm.
Belknap, thank you. And I think I'd read that once upon a time, but I didn't remember it. And that would make sense. The ending is open-ended, and you can either accept the open-endedness of the world or not, and they did. How can you do that? You live in a community in which you become who you are by loving and being loved, and that's what I think is going on with the boys.
You can, like Job's wife, say, "Curse God for the suffering. I've had enough," and I don't blame her for that. I cannot blame her for that. Or like Job, through that, say yes to it all. Wow, that's awe-inspiring. That's something I don't wish on anybody, but I think that's the kind of radical embrace of the entire thing that we see eye to eye on regarding the ending. Oh, this has been more than delightful, Terry, and I suppose if I'm not mistaken, I guess we have one more question has just popped up, and I want to ask that, and then we could draw to your closing comments. Aidan Anquil, can there be a claim that the political ideas and atheistic radicalism of demons can be described as the antithesis to what Dostoevsky talks about in the Brothers Karamazov about love and faith?
I'm not quite sure what to do with the demons, but I think there are many opposites. One is a kind of an institutionalism that attributes virtue to being in an institution, which I think Dostoevsky is completely against. Another would be the selfish sort of atheism we see in Rakitin. So I think that Dostoevsky is wending a path between places that are really antithetical to this kind of radical living of communal life that is neither reductionist, that is to communism or socialism or the kind of anthill view of humanity, and between the kind of individualistic American Western view of rugged individualism. I think he's going through all these things, and the opposition is multiple, not single.
I would, building off of your argument in the book, add maybe that sort of we know the argument in the book by the fruits that it bears within the book, right?
Yes.
And let's say where Ossorgin takes us, I know,
yes.
where Ossorgin takes up is kind of its own illustration of the fruits that certain aesthetic radicalism entails, right? Yeah. So in that way, I guess you could view the demons as articulate or illustrating, rather, performing in the novel with the help of the reader, an antithetical view, but it's one that sort of bears its own fruits in the end, by which we can judge that view.
Yes.
Does that seem fair? And that's, again, using your that's a Tillian lens through which I'm viewing both novels. Would you like to have anything to add before we talk about our next event?
Nope, I think that we've covered about everything that we can in this kind of time, and I want to thank you and the other participants for challenging and thoughtful questions, even when I couldn't answer them, and that I hope people will recommend the book for their libraries or buy it for themselves when it comes out in paperback in December. But more importantly, read the Brothers with other friends and figure out how you want to think about this great novel.
Hear, hear. Hurrah. With that in mind, I just want to point out that we'll have the most recent translator of the novel, Michael Katz, appearing on the Russia question, and we're actually reading his translation in my current seminar that I'm teaching on the Brothers Karamazov at Fordham University, and it is exquisite. I'll point to the ways in which it is, and I say this being indebted to Vivian Volkanovsky for all that they have revealed to me, and in no way devaluing what they've done. I think that you should actually read both. But Michael Katz has done something really wonderful here, and opened the novel and clarified certain things in ways that I sincerely appreciate. And if you're interested in this book, you might enjoy that next event, and it's coming up. I believe the date we have marked is April 12th. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, Terry, I hope you'll join us for that as well. In the meantime, thank you so much. Everyone should read this book to get more out of the original, to enrich the original. And thank you very much for joining us. And we'll hopefully see you before long.